So when we talk about Marx, there's a particular aspect of Marx's materialism having to do with ideology, specifically the question as to how does the economic material base, quote unquote, produce the ideological superstructure. Let me immediately signal it's a nuanced issue and there's some controversy and different opinions, but let me give you what seems to me to be the most plausible take. And parenthetically, I think that the story I'm going to give you now is usually associated with Jerry Cohen's functionalist approach, if you want to follow up on that. But in general, I remind everyone, Marx is complicated. Marxian scholarship is even more complicated, so I want to keep this simple and maybe a bit simplified. So I guess, in a simplest possible sense, maybe we can start with an example. So let's say we take a feudal society in which the landlords are directly in control of the lives of the serfs to a large extent. And it appears to me kind of an implausible thing to imagine that somehow kind of the property relationships themselves, the material relationships, give rise directly to the ideas. I think a better way to imagine this, and this is in line with Cohen's functional explanation, is to see this as kind of a two-tiered model, double-tracked model. There's a certain logic of the productive process in which, let's say, you have the land, which belongs to the lord, and the serfs are tied to the land and have to give up, have to surrender a certain amount of labor or produce to the lord. And there's one particular historical story to explain how that kind of arrangement emerges in itself. But then let's ask a different question. How do people justify this arrangement? And I think ideally one needs to have like this social history of ideas and maybe some kind of psychological account as to how the human psyche works. But again, without going into details, let's imagine some kind of an effective theory. Obviously, social reality is more complex, so this is a bit of like a toy model, a toy example. The notion is that, again, like, let's say a serf wakes up in the morning and asks themselves, like, how is it that I don't have to work and, there's a whole bunch of people who work on my land? And here's the key factor. Here's the key factor. The Lord, or actually any person, doesn't have to start from scratch. We, in a developed culture, always already find ourselves with a whole host of ideas. So, in a very important respect, I think the way in which kind of ideology operates or arises is not by generating the ideas, but rather kind of looking around for ideas that already are within a culture. So again, picking up from this point, in the Middle Ages, in the European Middle Ages, there's the Bible. And so what the Lord could do is, if the Lord can read themselves, they can open the Bible, or maybe they have the priest who's on their payroll. Obviously an oversimplified way to imagine this relationship, but still, kind of, the intellectuals, they open the Bible and they look through the pages. And the Bible is a long book. In fact, I remind you, not really a book, but a library, a collection of a huge number of texts. And so you find the texts within the book and the passages within the book, which seem to support this kind of material arrangement. So I think we're not talking about generation of ideas ex nihilo from the material base. We're talking about the process of selection. And I think it's important to hear kind of a Darwinian echo when we use this word selection. I think this is an analogy which very clearly Jerry Cohen has in mind with his functionalist approach. So kind of to continue with this example, one possible way is to imagine that you talk about this divine right of kings, that one way or another, God appoints the king appoints the lords, and so through the king, by God's command, God with a capital G, the ruler of the rightful ruler of the whole universe, commands you, the lowly serf, to be a serf of this particular master. Now, anybody who spent some serious time with the Bible understands, again, that it's a very complex collection of texts written throughout a, first probably composed orally and then written over a long period of time. And there's all sorts of things in the Bible, and the different ways you can read it. And this is just one particular way, yeah? And maybe to expand on this example, so if we, again, within this caricatured and oversimplified model, if we continue into the future and, you have the emergence of, I don't want to say bourgeoisie, well, I mean, effectively bourgeoisie, but we are talking about wealthy city dwellers, wealthy merchants. So all of a sudden, what you get is you have people who have accumulated capital, accumulated money, but who are not legally represented. Again, to a large degree, or at least there's a mismatch between the economic power that they actually wield and the political and legal standing that is not exactly recognized or not recognized to the fullest extent. So again, to keep this very simple, let's say you have a noble who has the title to a lot of power, but doesn't have actual power. And maybe now you have a merchant who is legally not supposed to have access, let's say, to political office, but as a matter of fact, has a lot of gold. And so what you get now is a mismatch between the dominant ideology and the economic reality, right? And Marx talks about this in terms of, I think, shackles, how kind of the old superstructure, becomes a shackle over the new emerging material base, new emerging socio-economic formation. So now to take this different example, so now you have a wealthy merchant, and they are looking for some kind of a way to justify their demands, which they feel legitimate. Again, there's presumably a psychological and even a neurophysiological, evolutionary psychological story to explain how exactly this process functions, like phenomenologically in a person's life and neurophysiologically in a person's head. But again, kind of for our purposes, we bracket that out and just try to focus on this sociological level of analysis. So what the merchant presumably does, again, it could be the merchant themselves, or it could be some kind of intellectual who is affiliated to the merchant, maybe their tutor, or maybe somebody who is patronized by the merchant. And this person looks around, the intellectual, somebody looks around, maybe in the Bible or maybe in some other text. Now, suddenly we remember that there's this Greek and Roman tradition that exists in the background of the culture. And so in other passages in the Bible, or maybe, let's say, in the ancient Greek Stoics, or Greek and Roman Stoics, you find these ideas suddenly of egalitarianism, that, all people are born equal, and all people, in some sense, have an equal standing before God. And maybe now, instead of emphasizing this idea that the king has a mandate from God to rule, maybe you emphasize, maybe you accentuate a different idea, that no, the king should be a good shepherd to the people. And the king's first or primary obligation is to the people. Or let's say, what God commands to the king is to be a good shepherd to the people. Now, again, these are grossly oversimplified examples, and for the purposes of this discussion, I don't think we really need to go into any detail, but I hope you can see kind of the general notion. So again, my contention is that it is wrong to see within this base and superstructure model, it's wrong to think of the material base as somehow directly producing the ideological superstructure, directly producing ideas. So I think a much better, a much more productive, and maybe a much more realistic way to talk about this is to say that yes, legal thinking has its own logic, philosophical thinking has its own logic, theological thinking has its own logic, artistic modes have a logic of their own, but, and here's the key point, this independent logic of ideas is constrained by the material reality in which the artists, the philosophers, the theologians, the legal scholars find themselves. And I think it's very useful to compare this process to, classical Darwinian evolution, biological evolution, right? So maybe you have these ideas within the background of a culture in a similar fashion as to how you have genes within the genome which are dormant, not expressed, right? And then something triggers their expression and they become expressed, right? Or another alternative is that maybe there's a random mutation and you get kind of new genetic material generated just randomly, right? And so the point, again, and this is to me the key point about this whole discussion, that again, the relationship between base and superstructure is a relationship of selection. Again, within Darwin, you have natural selection. Here we're not exactly talking about natural selection. I suppose you could call it cultural selection. And I do believe that this is a very powerful and a very robust picture, and also a picture which is very easy to overlook. And this dynamic, this power-laden dynamic, is indeed so very easy to overlook, because what goes on is a kind of an optical illusion. Let me illustrate. So take a particular philosophical context. So let's say, take somebody like Thomas Aquinas, right? And the temptation is to say, well, Aquinas is dominant in the Middle Ages just because he's the most brilliant philosopher around. He's so good at convincing people, yeah? And I have to say, I think that there's this trope in Marx, which maybe you could call fetishism, right? So Marx thematizes that this is what goes on in culture, that very often what people do is that we fetishize particular phenomena, which is to say we ascribe more reality, or we ascribe more reality to things which are less real, or maybe we ascribe reality to things which are completely unreal. Now, in this case, I think it's clearly true that, Aquinas was like a great intellect, like a powerful writer, among his peers. He was an outstanding intellect. But again, we ascribe too much reality to the power of his intellect if we say that's the only thing that's responsible for his ideas. Here, again, it's very important, and this is, Marx does this, Heidegger does this, and other philosophers too, but I guess Marx and Heidegger are the two that come to mind. This idea that philosophy is not done in a vacuum, that there's a social context to philosophical enterprise, and there are social conditions of thinking. As Marx says, in every epoch, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. And there's a simple reason for that. Because thinking is hard. It takes time. And in order to afford the time to think, you either need to be a member of the ruling class to have the leisure time to think, or to be lavishly sponsored by the ruling class. And that's just the beginning. That's the time you need to develop the ideas. But then, if you want those ideas to be heard, you need to have a good education to be able to communicate those ideas. So before you get those ideas, or after you get those, or independently from your ideas, you also need to be versed in the kind of parlance of the day. You need, and then kind of you write the ideas down, and these ideas need to be published and disseminated. And I mentioned a second ago this notion of optical illusion. So what exactly is the optical illusion? The optical illusion is that all of those ideas which did not align, at least to some extent, at least to a large extent, did not align or did not support, like went against the material conditions, went against the interests of the ruling class, those ideas have not survived. Those ideas were silenced, were suppressed. Those, let's say, universities or schools were defunded, or fell out of favor. Those books maybe were burnt, or again, you have to realize in ancient times or in medieval times, it's a very costly enterprise to reproduce books before the invention of the printing press. So, the books which don't serve the interest of the day could just, fall into oblivion and then disintegrate, and nobody just bothers to preserve them. So unless there's a lot of resources actively spent trying to preserve material like books, they crumble away. So again, in a very straightforward sense, you have this selection pressure. And I mean, in today's world, you could also add like PR and advertisement, right? So for books to succeed, I would imagine most of the time what needs to happen is that these books need to be very actively promoted. And I'm talking about current books which are being written right now, but also about, books of old. I mean, ask yourself, what are the books that you are reading, or what are the books that you're interested in? There needs to be some kind of a discovery mechanism, right? You need to see an advertisement, or maybe you open the textbook, and the textbook says, look, this is a great philosopher, you should pay attention to them. This is not such a great philosopher, he's useless, don't read them. Not to mention that, again, texts are long and complicated, and texts don't interpret themselves. So when you open something like, I don't know, Hobbes's Leviathan, by the way, who told you that Hobbes's Leviathan is a great book and should be paid attention to, right? Over and above all sorts of other books. But then you're also going to have textbooks and professors and YouTube videos, right, that are going to tell you what exactly does Hobbes's Leviathan mean. Draw your attention to particular passages in the text. And again, the Marxist insight is that this is not innocent. This is power-laden. And obviously, I mean, this is what I find deeply fascinating and what touches most of the students I communicate with deeply. Again, this scary thought, this terrifying thought, that there's a certain way in which this power structure, notice this power structure is completely anonymous. We're talking about this kind of automatic selection process. This is not a conspiracy, or not a conscious conspiracy, or at least it doesn't have to be a conscious conspiracy. So again, the terrifying thought that you have this structural power dynamic which has a way of getting inside of your head without you knowing it. This terrifying prospect, this grave suspicion, right? Kind of, a moment of paranoia, a moment of vertigo. How can I trust anything? How can I know anything? A terrifying thought? Yes, maybe, but also I think a deeply productive one. And again, we have this image of extreme skepticism and philosophers trying to somehow get to grips with this extreme skepticism, find a way out of extreme skepticism. And I think that we can legitimately say that this desire to somehow cure oneself of this extreme skepticism is what motivates much of Western philosophy, and possibly even philosophy outside the West as well.